Hey everyone! Before we begin today, we want to thank our newest patron, Peyton. Welcome to the team. If you want to be like Peyton and get access to our notes, outtakes, and more, head on over to patreon.com/pod and prejudice. And now enjoy part 4 of our discussion of the 2008 miniseries of Sense and Sensibility with our guests Zoe and Kelsey of Tea and Strumpets.
This is Becca.
This is Molly.
We're here to talk about Jane Austen.
We are here specifically to talk about the second part of the sometimes two-part, sometimes three-part 2008 Sense and Sensibility by our boy Andrew Davies. And we are joined with some guests today. We have Zoe and Kelsey from Tea and Strumpets, the podcast. Hi, Zoe and Kelsey.
Hi there.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
We're so excited that you're here.
Do you guys want to tell the people a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a podcast devoted to Regency romance. So I imagine your listeners probably already know what that is. I don't really need to get into that. But Regency romance novels. But we do, Victorian and Georgian as well. We'll like spread out a little bit. Um, so we talk about books and we talk to authors in the genre as well.
I mean, that is a fantastic concept for a podcast. I actually went ahead and listened to a couple of your guys' episodes, and I was very taken with it as someone who enjoys the Jane Austen Regency era novels that were written in the time period, but also enjoys the slightly more like decadent and fantasized world that contemporary authors have come up with for this time period.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I think what's really fun about it is, Jane Austen really started that genre. And there's so much homage paid to her in the contemporary authors who write in that era. I can't tell you how many times, actually, in a book for an author that we just read, we read the arc, and in it, there's a scene where she's like, "You've read Pride and Prejudice?" He's like, "I have sisters. Of course I've read Pride and Prejudice."
It's so funny. I was just thinking that. I was like, oh my gosh, in the last book we read, they actually referenced it. So
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. You know who loves Regency romance novels is my grandma. When I started this podcast, she emailed me and she was like, "Oh my gosh, if you are reading Jane Austen, there are all of these books that you can get on Amazon.com that are Regency romance novels, and it's all I've been reading since 2016." Like, she has not picked up another kind of book, only Regency romance.
Go, Grandma, go.
Well, a little happily ever after has been needed since 2016. So I
That's
feel
exactly.
I feel what your grandma's feeling.
Yeah, she was like, "I can't deal with this real life anymore. I'm going to the Regency era."
I was just telling Zoe I needed to read a book that like wasn't a Regency romance novel or a romance novel in general, but I'm just like, but when I pick up a book, I just want a happily ever after and some fun kooky antics along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I read a lot of like really intense, depressing nonfiction in my off time. And every time I turn back to Regency era literature, whether it be Jane Austen or more recent example would be like the Tea Rose, I'm always like, oh, you know what? You know what? This is better. This feels like a warm blanket.
Mhm.
So, on the note of Jane Austen, we start off with all of our guests talking about their experience with Jane Austen novels themselves and the Jane Austen canon, as it were, in the 21st and late 20th century. So, the first question is, what is your relationship to Jane Austen?
Well, Zoe and I have talked about this at the beginning, and we are probably like, we're fans of Jane Austen in concept, but in actual like reading, we're not so great. I I try to read classic literature, and like every time I like really into it, and then like something happens and I don't pick up the book for a few days, and then a few days turns into a few weeks, and then a few weeks turns into a few months, and then it's a few years later and I still haven't finished the book. But I have read multiple versions of Pride and Prejudice. I think the one that I was able to get through start to finish was actually a very beautifully illustrated graphic novel of Pride and Prejudice.
Ooh.
And I that was gorgeous because it was all the dialogue directly taken from the book. And of course, it was just done in a graphic novel format. So it
I
was
love that.
beautiful. And then, of course, I read Emma in high school, and I've watched Sense and Sensibility now multiple versions of it. So that's kind of where I'm at with my Jane Austen.
We are not, you must read the original books snobs with fandom. You can enjoy the movies and the canon in other ways, other than the original books. That is my take personally on Jane Austen. She's for everyone.
And I will add for my relationship with Jane Austen is that I have even less than Kelsey. I think that my first introduction to Jane Austen was somehow Sense and Sensibility, the 1995 movie, made its way onto my TV screen. And I was in love. Like, immediately, I just, like, I fell in love. It was like it became one of my favorite movies of all time. And I just, like, I loved everything about it. So then, of course, I was like, well, I'll pick up the book. And this was probably 10 years ago because I had never, at that point, I had, first of all, never read historical romance, which is a little different, but I'd never read that. I was just a fantasy reader. That was really all that I read. And so I pick up Sense and Sensibility, and I think I had the same kind of issue where I'm out of high school, I'm out of college, I haven't read classic literature, and it just didn't quite draw me in the way that my fantasy novels did. So, I was thinking that I read about 2/3 of Sense and Sensibility, but today I noticed that that book is still on my bookshelf, and it looks like I got to page 149 because there's a bookmark in it.
Out of curiosity, where were you in it?
Uh it looks like Colonel Brandon is saying that he's telling Eleanor about his ward and her pregnancy. That's what it looks like. Has been such a unhappy resemblance between the fate of mother and daughter, and I so perfectly I have discharged my trust. As soon as she recovered from her lying in, I found her near delivery. I removed her and the child. Yeah, so that must be that point. So but what I remember is as I was reading the book, I was enchanted, I was immediately transported to the scenes that I had seen in the movie, and it was one of those kind of, like, Princess Bride moments where I felt like the book and the movie were, like, so kind of simpatico, like, they both were giving me the same thing, and they made me happy in different ways. But that was about 10, 12 years ago, and I haven't picked it up since.
Wow.
Yeah, I was gonna say kind of what I've told Molly while we've been covering Sense and Sensibility. Because when we covered Pride and Prejudice, the BBC edition of Pride and Prejudice is basically word for word the book, whereas the more famous version of Sense and Sensibility is this movie with Emma Thompson that kind of puts its own little spin on the story, but creates something sort of masterful on its own.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, my favorite version of Emma is still Clueless. So
So Molly has seen Clueless, but doesn't remember any of it, but she does now know it's based on Emma.
it's really great when the most recent Emma came out, but I really love her name is escaping me.
Gwyneth Paltrow?
Gwyneth Paltrow. There you go.
Oh my
Thank you.
gosh, I was right?
Yeah, it's the Gwyneth Paltrow version of Emma.
I can never get them straight in my head. Like, who is she?
Yeah, so there's the most recent Emma that came out, which was beautiful, like costume wise and like cinematography wise is gorgeous. But then I really think that the one with Gwyneth Paltrow was just very classic to the book. But then again, just Clueless is great. And you can watch it and then you read Emma and you're like, oh, it really is like the same thing.
I can't wait.
It's one of the only adaptations of a Jane Austen that's like pretty on point and set in the modern day.
Yeah.
So on that, I think we just had Kelsey answer this question, but the next question is, what is your favorite piece of Jane Austen content? And do we specify it does not have to be a book? It can be an adaptation, a filmed version. So I'm guessing Clueless for you.
I mean, Clueless is great because the best thing about Clueless is you have zero idea it's based on Emma the first time you watch it. Like the first, I didn't know. And then all of a sudden, we're discussing Emma in high school and they're like, Clueless. And I was like, what? No way. And then now, every time I watch it, I am now transported to Emma, the story. And I'm like, it's totally 100% the same thing. Like, it's amazing. And it's just such a good modern day take of it. And they truly did something that felt very original while still maintaining like the essence of the characters and the storyline from the source material.
I totally agree with that. And without spoiling anything for Molly, because Emma is in fact our next book, I will say that something about Emma as a novel makes it much better fodder to adapt to a very contemporary
Mhm.
script
Yeah.
than some of the other stuff we've been reading. And I'll get to that when we get to Emma and when we get to Clueless, because Clueless is like the one modern adaptation we're gonna put in our like general roster for watching.
Yay!
Perfect. Yes.
Yes. Well, my favorite piece I've sort of already said as well, which is the 1995 Sense and Sensibility.
Which is amazing. I love that movie too.
I just love it. I mean, I think top 3 movies for me in general, definitely also include The Princess Bride, and I think that those movies are they have a very similar feel in a lot of ways. And so I love it. I love the cast. I love the everything. I really do. So, I don't wanna talk too much about it because we're gonna talk all about Sense and Sensibility today. So,
Absolutely. But I'm glad we brought you on for a different adaptation
yeah.
that is similar to the one you like so much.
Yes.
So we have 2 more questions. One is, which Austen character do you relate to the most?
So for me, it's really interesting. I should say I have also seen Pride and Prejudice. So it's like, I've seen a couple of these, a couple more Austen works than just the ones that I've mentioned. But I think it's really interesting because I think that all 3 of the Dashwood sisters are very much me at those stages of my life. Like Meg is totally me as a kid. Like I was very much like talking all the time and like very creative and like the one in the tree house or playing pretend or hidden in the library. Like that's that's very me as a kid. And then I think like teenage me was very much the romantic, like very much like I am going to find my happily ever after. Why isn't there magic in the world? Like like I was very very much like kind of head in the clouds. And then not to bring it down too much, but I had like a family tragedy happen. And I think that that really did kind of ground me a little bit and turn me into the more practical Eleanor. So I think like I so relate to all 3 of them because I see myself in all of them. But I would say that me nowadays is very much like Eleanor. Like, I'm just the one who has to make the practical decisions and who always thinks kind of that way first. But maybe with a dash of Marianne's emotion in there too.
It's very relatable content.
Kelsey, do you have an answer?
Yes, I do have an answer. And I just needed to look up the name because I am horrendous at remembering anybody's names ever. And so I'm gonna go with Harriet Smith, the friend of Emma who is subject to all her matchmaking. And I think the reason why I identify with her is, very much like she's just a genuinely kind person, like, and she's like really truly like Emma does really truly see her as a friend. But at the same time, too, it's like she has the fallacy of like wanting to be in the in crowd, absorbing too much of the in crowd, and then like wanting to kind of find herself again. And like, so I feel like that's just been a story of my life and like learning to just like me and be okay with like where I am in life and loving that. And
Aw.
so there you go. I'm gonna identify with that.
I love that. I think you're the first guest we've had on who says she relates to Harriet Smith, and I love Harriet, so I'm very excited by that answer. And then last question I have for you guys, and there is no rules to this one, but what is your hottest Austen take?
Okay, so I'm gonna answer this one honestly. I'm 34 years old. I don't feel like I'm that old, but I had to like Google what a hot take was. So, and then I was like, is it what I think it is? Like, I know this is so silly, but like, I really wasn't quite sure what a hot take was. So I have a very boring answer, which is I just don't think that I actually have that much. I have enough Austen knowledge to have a hot take on it yet. So I have nothing to to throw in the hot take bowl. I'm sorry.
We'll see if anything comes up over the course of the episode.
Yes.
Can you tell me what a hot take is?
For our listeners, obviously everybody on this call knows what a hot take is.
Yeah,
obviously.
totally.
So just for our listeners who might not know, a hot take is sort of an unpopular opinion that you might have
Oh.
about Jane Austen works. So, for example, one of my hot takes about Jane Austen is that Lydia is kind of a misunderstood tragic hero.
Oh,
Um,
that is
because
very
she
interesting.
she's a girl who's like she's very selfish for sure, but she also is a girl who's just in touch with her own sexuality in an era when that was not okay, and she gets really punished for it. So I think it's actually a very tragic story. So that would be an Austen hot take.
Mhm, mhm. And, like, my Austen hot take is more of a hot take for myself because of what I've decided for myself about my personality, but, I like David Morrissey's Colonel Brandon better than Alan Rickman's Colonel Brandon, and that's my hot take, and Becca hates me now.
That's also your problematic characteristic.
I know, I know, I know. And listen, Alan Rickman as Colonel Brandon was my phone background for months, and then I saw this movie, and I was like, I don't know anymore, I don't know who I am, so that's my hot take.
I hope we're still able to talk to each other at the end of this call.
Oh, no.
Honestly, we've been friends for what, at this point, 8 years, and this might end our
I
friendship
know, I
and our
know, I know.
podcast.
But I have to stick to my guns. I said it on the air last time, so I was like, "Well, I can't take it back now."
Okay, so I have like an hour and a half to maybe try to convince you otherwise. Is that what?
Yes. Yeah.
Pretty much, pretty much.
Totally open to any mind changing that may occur.
Yes, and, Alan Rickman worshiping is sort of part of the vibe of this podcast, so feel free to go as in on that as you want
All right,
to.
that sounds good.
Okay. I know what my hot take is. I know what my hot take is. I know what it is. I think Jane Austen is better watched than read.
That is a hot take, but I think a fair one because it is more palatable to the contemporary eye.
Mhm. And, like, also too, just I'm not gonna lie, like, there's just Jane Austen as well as plenty of other authors in that time because, any work that was serialized or anything like that, there's just sometimes they're overly descriptive about things, and
Yeah.
it's like, get to the point and move on. And I think that's where I'm always lost is because like, we get into, like, crazy descriptions that last pages and pages, or it's like they're sitting in the parlor and nothing's happening, like, the story is not moving forward, and yet we're here for, like, a chapter. And I'm like, "Why?"
You can also say J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah. I was gonna say, how do you guys feel about Lord of the Rings?
As someone who really has actually never watched or read any of it, like,
You don't gotta.
That was one of my pandemic projects, and I can tell you, I ended up really enjoying the last book, but you can watch the
It
movies.
took you a long time to get to the last book, though.
Oh, it took me 2 years. I was like I finished Lord of the Rings, like, in 2022, and I started it, like, March 2020.
I had all of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit books read to me by my dad starting when I was about 6.
That's beautiful.
but that's wonderful.
So I know he skipped over some of the scary parts, but it's interesting because I've never picked them back up, kind of for that reason, where I'm like, like I had this beautiful experience with something, like why, why spoil it with reality, right?
No, I 100% agree with that. And I think too, like, I mean, I might have seen part of one of the Lord of the Rings movies. It just was like, it's funny for as much as I love fantasy, that was not a fantasy that triggered me in any interest.
I mean, it's a much shorter read if you only read the scenes with women in it, so, like,
Mhm,
you can knock that out in a weekend.
mhm.
Although I did watch the movie about J.R. Tolkien, like the movie about his life.
What's that?
I can't remember what it's called because I'm terrible with names of anything, but there is a movie about his life, and it's actually, like, quite interesting and quite good because he talks about how, like, his experience in World War One actually, like, led to his idea about, the books and, like, creating the books and the story.
Wow. Well, speaking of books and stories, I guess we should jump in to the 2008 Sense and Sensibility. So, we are talking today about the second part of the two-part miniseries. Sometimes it's 3 parts. If you are listening along with this, where we just left off was the end of the part 1, which was Marianne sitting on the riverside with her scarf being sad that Willoughby has disappeared. So, now we get this like opening sequence with the theme song and the shells waving in the wind. And I liked that we got little flashes of what's to come and it like faded in on little scenes from what was about to happen. And I was like, that's not familiar to me. And then I realized that it was like things that happened in this episode. So little treats.
It's like when you get a new title sequence in a season of a TV show where they like cut a bunch of the episodes that are upcoming into the title sequence. I'm thinking of Friends, but Gilmore Girls did this, I think.
Yeah.
Gilmore Girls they kept a lot of the same stuff from season 1 all the way to season 7.
Yeah, they did. But they kept some like key scenes, but then they like changed up a couple of them as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I have a question for the book readers here. Barton Cottage, is it a seaside cottage in the book?
Oh, yes, it is. It is a seaside tale.
This is a seaside tale. It takes place in Devonshire, which
Okay.
is in the south of England. And we get some laughs from our British listeners on this a little bit. But my understanding is that it is a very mountainous region
Mhm.
that has a long coast of fishing towns. So my understanding of where the Dashwoods live is sort of like on a mountain cliff near-ish the sea.
Got it.
And so therefore this is a seaside tale and all the longing is part of the seashell, sea waves, sea-ness of it all.
Though potentially not as seaside-y as this one makes it.
I had a feeling that was something that they took from the book and put into this adaptation. So I really did want to ask that. And I asked the right people.
Yeah. Because in the 1995, it's more of a lakeside tale, which every time we were watching it, and Becca was like, yeah, see, it's a seaside tale. I'm like, that's not the sea.
It's wet.
Because this was a refrain when we were reading the book. I was like, Molly, this is a seaside tale. It's a sister's seaside tale where the sisters are by the sea.
Yes. So we get the waves crashing and Marianne looking out the window being sad, and Eleanor in the middle of the night comes down to talk to her mother and get a glass of water, and Mrs. Dashwood is writing a letter. And Eleanor asks if she's writing to John, and at first Mrs. Dashwood says yes, and then she says, no, to tell you the truth, I wanted to invite Edward because I'm surprised he hasn't come to see us yet. And in our last episode, I couldn't think of the word for the face that Eleanor does so well, and I figured it out while I was watching this time. It's incredulous. She's incredulous at everyone around her that they just like keep saying things and she's like, "What are you doing?" And so she looks at her mother.
Do you mean
incredulously.
indignant or incredulous?
No, incredulous. She cannot believe it, and she's shocked in disbelief, kind of annoyed but kind of amused. Incredulous, that's the word.
That's such a good definition. I love it.
She's got that wide-eyed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This actress for Eleanor does wide-eyed really good.
Yes.
In fact, sometimes I was like, are you actually your eyes supposed to be that big, or is that just your eyes? Because every time they like close up on her face, her eyes are huge, and I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah, like you can see the whites around her irises all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was watching this with my boyfriend Mike, and he just looks at the screen and goes, did they make her eyes wider in that shot in post?
She also gets like the red rimmed
Mm-hmm.
really well. Like her eyes will be totally normal and then something will happen and immediately they'll go red rimmed. It's impressive. Eyeball acting.
Yeah. It's really impressive.
So Eleanor says that if Edward doesn't come of his own accord, then it's for good reason, and she doesn't want her mom to embarrass him by like begging him to come, and she doesn't want him to come reluctantly or unwillingly. So Mrs. Dashwood then like puts the letter away and closes the box, and she does this little sassy shrug like, okay, whatever you say. I'm obsessed with her.
So passive aggressive.
I think that's just a highlight of all Regency romance, whether it's past or present, is mother needing to stick her finger in the pie because it's not happening soon enough. And like these kids need to get their act together.
Mhm.
I'm trying to be supportive, but also you need to get married.
Yeah. So then we go to the next day, and Marianne and Eleanor are walking through the woods, and Marianne is just reciting poetry that Willoughby has taught to her, and it's gross. And Eleanor is like, maybe you wouldn't be so sad all the time if you stopped, thinking about him all the time.
And then she says, he is in me, Eleanor, to which I thought, well, he almost was.
He would have liked to be, for sure.
Yes, that line was very intentionally put there.
To Kelsey and Zoe, I don't know if you guys went ahead and watched the first episode of
Oh,
this
yeah.
miniseries.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, when Willoughby came onto the screen, I was like, "Hey, he's from Mamma Mia."
Yes, we said the same thing. We said the same thing.
Except I was like, no, he's Howard Stark.
Oh, that's true. He is. He is.
Wow, both of those things went over my head. Yeah, my first impression of Willoughby was like, oh, this guy gives me the major creep douche chills from moment one.
I mean, he is a major creep douche
Yeah.
and he needs some chill. So
Yeah.
Well, his name starts with W, and I feel like Austen really liked her bad guys to start with W.
Yes, 100%. I will say, and we'll get to this later on, but I thought in part 1, I was like, "You know what? I can kind of, like" I always have sympathized, like, a little bit with Willoughby, like, I've thought not, like, sympathized with him, but I've seen where he's coming from more so in the 1995, but I was like, "Oh, I can see what they're, like, attempting to do with his little puppy dog face or whatever." And then in this one, he was just so slimy and grody the
Oh,
whole
yeah.
time, like, even more so than he is in the book.
I had to give a definition of what the word rake was to my husband because my
Mm.
husband watched it with me, and then we got more interest on Willoughby, and I was like, "He's just a rake. He's a rake of the first order." And my husband's like, "Huh? What are you saying?" And I was like, "A rake, a scoundrel." And he's like, "What?" And I was like, "Seducer of women. That is a rake."
and of little girls in this one.
Yes.
In our book episodes, I would look up words that I didn't understand, often along those lines, and then I would put, like, a little glossary of terms and phrases that I had to look up in the show notes in case people were reading it for the first time and didn't understand Austen's language. So, speaking of him, Eleanor's like, "Maybe you shouldn't be thinking about him all the time," and then she's like, "Well, he's in me, blah, 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 blah." And then Margaret just, like, is in a tree above them, and as she always is, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, there's someone coming." And it's a man on a horse, and Marianne is certain that it's Willoughby. She's like, "I knew he would come, I knew it." And then Margaret's like, "It's Edward."
I feel like all Margaret got to say was it's Edward. Like
Yes.
there were like I wish I'd counted from the beginning because I think she said it at least 3 times
Yeah.
and didn't have very many lines in the second half anyway.
Yeah, my mom texted me and went, "What would they do without Margaret? She's always announcing when Edward's coming."
She's the one who can see the riders from the distance, and she's like, "It's Colonel Brandon coming to the house."
Yeah.
And it leads them to my favorite Austen trope in the adaptations, which is the clean up the house before the suitor gets
Oh my
there
god, I
trope.
love it. And they're all like sitting there like Eleanor strips off her apron and then he arrives and they're all sitting perfectly in the parlor.
It's perfect. Although this time they're just walking and they all turn and just start running and Margaret's like, "Wait for me, wait for me." And I did like this because in the book, I didn't understand how Marianne could do like such a 180 from being so sad that it wasn't Willoughby to being happy that it was Edward and Becca was like, "Well, like she really cares about her sister." And I was like, "Yeah, but she was so upset a minute ago." But in this she was like, "Okay, Edward is the only person that it could be that would make her not like angry that it wasn't Willoughby." I got it this time. So they're walking with Edward, and he tells them that he's been there for a fortnight. And he said he was visiting some old friends. And then they added from the book that he was not happy about visiting those friends. He was like, "I was visiting some friends for my sins." And Eleanor is like, "So it wasn't a good visit then?" And he says, "No, but that was my own fault for some reason or another." And I was like, I like that. They are hinting that he's a good guy.
Yeah, I actually thought that was an interesting addition to compared to at least what I know of from the other adaptation because I felt like in here there hadn't yet been very much or any development to kind of their storyline in a long time. And so this
Mhm.
gave you a hint of like something so that at least when like other pieces of the puzzle started to fall, you could remember that as a viewer like, "Oh, he mentioned something." So,
Mhm.
I thought that was needed.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, this is a scene from the book that was cut from the 1995, and they kind of Emma Thompson in her script tries to give us a little bit of this in that scene with the horses in the stables in the 95,
Yes.
where she says, like, where he's like, "Have you ever been to Plymouth?" And she goes, "Plymouth? Oh no." That whole scene, and they try to accomplish all that happens in this visit, which takes a long time in this
Yeah.
adaptation through that scene. It shortchanges it a little bit, but I understand why it's done.
Yeah.
Dearest reader, British art jewelers Tatty Devine are delighted to announce their collaboration with Chawton House, the English Grade II listed Elizabethan manor house and home to women's early writing. Delve into the world of pioneering female writers and treasures from its library of 10,000 books, designed in East London and handmade in Kent by Tatty Devine's all-female team. Bridgertons and Featheringtons can indulge in a playful array of laser-cut acrylic book covers, fall for everlasting florals, and discover odes to literary heroines, including Jane Austen, a frequent visitor to Chawton House. Tatty Devine was so kind as to send us a few pieces of jewelry. I got the Jane Austen bookshelf necklace, and Becca got the Pride and Prejudice pendant. These pieces are absolutely gorgeous. I love how lightweight they are, and you can totally dress them up or down. You could really wear these anywhere. They're classy and simple, but they still make a statement. So, debutantes and heroines, begin your collection of original art jewelry, handmade in Britain at www.tattydevine.com today. That's TATTYDEVINE.com, and get free international shipping on all orders with code DARCY. Yes. So we cut to dinner and we have this conversation where Marianne is like, "You don't really need money to be happy. Like, what is wealth?" And Eleanor's like, "Well, wealth's important too." And Marianne's like, "Have we not been happy here? And we as poor as the gypsies?" And Eleanor is like, "I think we'd be a little happier if we had a little more money." And they're kind of like joking and they turn to Edward and they're like, "What do you think?" And he gets stressed. And he's like, well, I think that money can solve some problems. For others, it's completely useless." And they're like staring at him like, "What?" Like, why are you being so intense right now?
And then he just like broodingly looks away and like
Yeah.
gets very quiet.
Yeah. And he puts his hand in front of his face in this kind of contemplative way. And that's when Mrs. Dashwood is like, "Oh, I like your ring. Is that your sister's hair?"
Oh my God. How can you not take the ring off, Edward? Like I don't understand.
I've got like Hermione Granger's voice in my head going, "What an idiot."
It's also like a hulking ring, too. It's like half his finger.
What is it with these people and pinky rings? Guess not on his pinky.
Oh, I don't know, but let's just be real about the whole Victorian, like, locks of hair jewelry that was all made. I find it all very fascinating.
Molly had a full meltdown when we were reading the book because of the amount of hair exchanged in the book.
Well, they didn't have much in those days, right?
That's
Just-
true.
I'm teasing.
But the thing is that Willoughby, the way that when he took her hair, he smelled it and like kissed it.
Ugh.
I was just like, that's so weird.
Oh, the whole hair taking scene with Willoughby and Marianne, I was like, this is just awkward. Like, I understand what you're trying to do with the cinematography to make it all romantic and cute, but it's really awkward the way he like sneakily, like slyly, like pulls the scissors from his pocket. I'm like, just don't.
And then he turns to Margaret, who is there in the room while this like quasi-sexual thing is happening, and just goes, "Shh."
Yeah, it's all so gross. It's all so gross.
I think about a third of my notes are things like Willoughby is so skeezy. I can't with Willoughby and Marianne. I get douche chills.
I like douche chills as a phrase.
It's a good phrase. Yeah, for sure.
But you know who's not a douche? Ish.
Well, Edward, they really they downed his doucheism for the filmed adaptations because they need you to like him. Unless I just like really, I don't know.
I think you just overblew his doucheism in the book.
Yeah.
I don't know, because with Edward, I was like, I want to sympathize with you, dude, but like, you really done fucked up.
He really done fucked up. He is in a pickle, as we've said before, and like this scene really shows that. I want to say I skated over when Marianne tells Eleanor that she has no soul because she thinks that they need money to be happy, and Eleanor says, "I might not, but I flatter myself I have a little sense,"
It's in the title.
which is in the title. But yes, Eddie is. I can't sympathize with him that much, but in this one, when later on, and we'll get to this, but when he and Eleanor are like finally talking about their feelings a little bit, she says, "I would not have thought so well of you if you had acted differently," because she like really respects his honor and like, or not his honor, but his like, he respects his word.
His honor. Yeah.
And I will say that scene was really important too, because when she does confront him, because she's very much like, you didn't make me any promises. Like, there was assumptions, but you did not blatantly give me a promise. So like, am I hurt? Yes, but like, you didn't actually promise me anything. It was just implied.
I feel like there's also another angle in this adaptation, which is Dan Stevens. Like
Yes.
Dan Stevens, you almost don't care. You're just like, yeah, whatever. It's okay.
Yeah.
Like it's fine. Can you look at me with those eyes again? Yeah, that's
The
great.
piercing blue eyes.
Yeah.
Ugh.
And he really has so much charisma and like has this kind of genuine like something to him in this role that I mean like yeah, I would forgive any assumptions as well.
Well, and he really got the best genes in that family, because let me tell you, his brother and sister, mm-mm.
I think Fanny's hot, personally, but
The woman who plays Fanny is hot. I'm not sure why she married John Dashwood.
Yeah, it's so funny because for how snooty she is, it's like, "Then why'd you marry that guy?"
yeah.
You know, you're real snooty for someone who married into the
Well,
family.
for his monies,
Yeah.
it's for
Yeah.
it's the economics of dating in Jane Austen.
Fair.
So, speaking of the Dan Stevens angle, though, we have arrived at what might be my favorite scene, and I think this is the scene that people were telling me about on the Instagram when I was talking about how hot maybe it was Mr. Darcy or something in the water. I don't know, but someone was like, "Wait till you get to Dan Stevens chopping wood," and I was like, "Yeah."
It's the female gaze for sure.
Yeah.
That scene also strangely reminded me of the new Beauty and the Beast when he's like the beast and like I think he gets wet on the like the rooftop but it somehow was like very much like oh I see that's this young Dan Stevens but I see the older Dan Stevens as a beast. It worked for me either way.
Yeah, and
But
I was seeing him as the Russian in Eurovision Song Contest Story of Fire Saga as he's like doing his
Oh
dance.
my gosh, I didn't even put that together, but he's literally my favorite character in
I
that
know, he's
movie
so
because
good.
he's so and like when he does the dance and like the sexiness that
And
happens.
Lion of Love.
Yeah, I love it. Ah!
Oh, I love him so much.
Mike's take on this scene was very specifically, I must chop wood sexily in the rain to distract myself from how much I want to bang you.
He said that he needs to relieve his feelings.
yeah.
He said relieve his feelings, and then he like chops the wood. So he's chopping wood in the rain, and his like white flouncy shirt, and then he like looks up, and Eleanor is just standing there watching him with her mouth hanging open. It's so funny, and she's standing in the rain with her scarf over her head, and she's like, "You don't have to do that." And he was like, "Oh, I like this kind of work, and you have very little help here." And then she says, "We manage," and he says, "Yes, but if only." And she says, "What is it?" And he says, "Nothing that I can speak of." And then he chops the wood again.
Very hot.
Ugh.
Oh, it's my favorite. It's so good. Then he leaves, and that night, Marianne asks Eleanor if the hair in his ring was in fact hers. And she said, "It did look like my hair, but he never asked me for a lock of it." What I have to say is that her hair is not at all the same color as Lucy Steele's hair.
No.
No.
Lucy's hair looks like Fanny's hair. It was a great lie.
Yeah. Was she lying? I thought because she like smiled afterwards. So I felt like she had like kind of tricked herself into thinking like maybe somehow it could be mine.
Oh, yeah.
You're totally right. I was saying Edward's lie was a good one, that it was Fanny's hair.
Oh.
It was very believable.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But how did Eleanor think that it was her hair is what I'm saying. Because, like, she definitely does think it.
Yeah. But it's like very many shades away from her hair. Very many.
I don't know. As someone who's never given a lock of hair to anybody, I really don't know how we understand these things.
Yeah, the rest of us who have all given locks of hair to people, we're trying to figure this out.
If they could comment on it, that would be great.
I'm just imagining Molly's girlfriend's facial expression if she just presented her with a lock of her hair.
I know what my husband's reaction would be because, like, for a horse person, like, it's very common, like, if you have, like, a horse that's special to you who dies, like, they have, like, people who, like, make charms and things out of, like, the tail hair because it's, like, really strong and stuff, and my husband's like, "That's really morbid. Why do you have a horsehair bracelet around?" And I'm like, "Because it's for Danny, who just was the sweetest boy around." And he's like, "That's weird." I was like, "Okay, good to know." So if I gave him a lock of my hair, he'd be like, "The F is this?"
That would be really funny, though. That would be a fun, like, April Fool's Day
That would
thing.
be.
You're like, I know you like my horsehair bracelet so much. I got you one for me.
Yeah.
Because I'm the sweetest girl.
Yeah. So, yeah, she does think it's her hair. They are lying there talking about how they think Edward still loves her, but Eleanor's like, but he didn't say anything. And Marianne's like, well, why did he come here if not to propose to you? And Eleanor's like, I don't know. And then they just lie there for a little bit and are sad. And then the next day, John Middleton arrives and brings the Palmers over. Now, no one will ever be Hugh Laurie as Mr. Palmer. So this Mr. Palmer to me was kind of a nothing character, but I did like that when Mrs. Jennings said that Charlotte was pregnant, Mr. Palmer went, ugh.
Yes. That moment made me like remember Hugh Laurie. I was like,
Yes.
"Oh yeah, Hugh," and da 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 da.
Yeah.
But it was still a good moment for that actor as well.
Yes, it was a good moment. Hugh Laurie is just so handsome,
But Hugh Laurie does that type of character very well too.
so well. Yeah, how did this become a Hugh Laurie stan podcast? It's all good.
It's very simple. You watch the 1995 adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, and suddenly your life becomes about what Hugh Laurie does in that film for like fully 10 minutes total.
Yes. So John says that they must all come to Barton for dinner because they're expecting their nieces, the Miss Steeles later. And I wanted to point out that neither of the main adaptations that we've seen have done this the way that it was done in the book, which is at least the way that I read it and understood it was that Mrs. Jennings was just like out and about on the town and Lucy Steele was like, "Oh my gosh, like we're related." And, like found her and they like bumped into each other and they invited them over and then they ended up staying for a long time. That was how I understood that it happened in the book. Now that has never made sense to me and there are a lot of things that never made sense in the book, like them having lunch at Brandon's friend's house instead of Delaford, like all of the things that were weird in the book, they've kind of just fixed in the movies. This being one of them.
Are there 2 Miss Steeles in the 95 and the book?
There are 2 Miss Steeles in the book and the 2008.
They kill Anne in the 95.
Okay, because I was like, I don't feel like I remember there being 2. I just remember Lucy Steele.
No, we'll get there, but Lucy Steele is like the ultimate villain of this book in a lot of ways, in a kind of cool way.
Yeah.
Even possibly more so than Willoughby. And it is interesting because the 95 actually does dumb her down a little bit and sweeten her up a little bit
Yeah.
just so she can be stupid enough to tell Fanny about Edward.
Yeah.
Whereas in the book and in this adaptation, it's Anne who does the telling. Although this adaptation could have pushed her to be even meaner. She was meaner, but
I didn't see Lucy as mean. I almost got the like flippity gibbet, like so in love, like not being mean to tell it, like just
More worried.
I just need to confide it in someone. Like I'm worried. Like she was very much like like a she evoked more sympathy. Like I didn't see any evil. Like I didn't see any evil vibes from her. So then like when the twist ending happens, I was like, huh? I'm so confused.
Yeah, I felt like she wasn't an evil mastermind or like a real mean girl, which is how I would describe, that type of character today, where she's like trying to get into the other girl's head and like, kind of just a lot of passive aggressiveness. Where I felt like this version of Lucy Steele was kind like a little bit more, like you said, of an airhead, but who maybe saw some competition and kind of just wanted to gently push them out of the way and saw that, oh, this person isn't going to resist that much once I just tell them something. And then that was kind of it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's super interesting because the book's Lucy Steele is such an evil mastermind. The 95's Lucy Steele is a weird combination of the two with her like evil looks and like really kind of mean girl vibes. This Lucy Steele, they really played into her at least showing that she's in love with Edward and like really trying to guard her secret so she doesn't show so much as like if you know what's coming, you know that she's being kind of like she's like a little viper in the grass or whatever,
Viper
but
in a
like
bosom, you might say.
yes, a viper in my bosom, as one might say, but, like but she really doesn't show any of that to the audience or to Eleanor, like, she does seem really innocent about it, and she seems really hurt when Mrs. Ferrers then later on when we'll get there, when she, like, is like, "You aren't welcome here anymore." It's so interesting because I just am so used to them playing up her evilness, but you're so right that in this one, it really does almost seem like she doesn't have any ulterior motives.
Yeah, I did not get ulterior motives from her. I was, like, really shocked with how everything worked out in the end.
This is slightly a tangent, but it's relevant, so I'll say it. Lucy Steele, I've yet to see a Lucy Steele who's as vicious as she is in the books, and
Mhm.
it's very, like, explicit in the books that she is actually trying to torture Eleanor
Mm.
in this time period and eliminate her as competition, keep her close to keep her away from Edward
Yeah.
because she sees the threat of a woman who's from a little bit higher birth than she is and has a little bit more money than she does to her whole scheme to get Edward. And that like her main trick of the trade is like exceeding flattery to blind everyone around her to her low class status. She's actually a very brilliant tactician in the books, and I think that generally in the story they try to go for the twist ending with Robert over anything else.
Yeah, you see hints of that, I think, in the 95, but you don't even really get any hints of that here. She's a lot flatter, which I think is as a little bit of a disservice to the character and to the plot because I think that it adds so much more interest. Now, I don't love like, women against women kind of plots in general, but I think that they're also important and necessary, and when they're done right and they show how hurtful and how awful that can be, I think that that's also an important story to tell.
Yeah, and I think it really is the piece of Jane Austen that kind of gets pushed to the side gently in a lot of adaptations,
Mm,
which is the class narrative. And
yeah.
Lucy Steele is ultimately just a woman of a very low birth who is out for blood and money for her own marriage.
I mean, good on her, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's how she's gonna uplift herself in the world. It's the only way.
Right. I mean, we love Lucy Steele on this podcast, let's
We
make that clear.
we love we find Lucy Steele to harm our main heroine, our girl Eleanor, quite a bit, but we also respect her game.
Yeah. And I think like from the 95 adaptation, like I remember being like, I'm so glad that things worked out for her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, because like I, like, yeah, she was kind of a bitch, but like, like I see the same thing where it's like, women have so little at this time period and marriage is like all they're groomed for, all they're told their whole lives. And like, good for her for getting it.
I think you can probably sneak in an economics of dating in Jane Austen sting if you want one. We have a sound effect.
Yes, we do. So, yeah, speaking of the Steeles, we meet them, and I will say that Anne is everything that I had ever hoped she would be.
I like when they open on that scene and it's just like her face and she's like, "So do you have any bows? We don't have any good bows." Like there's a couple, but like I really don't like them when they're really gross. But when they're handsome, oh my god. I'm like, this chick, man. I was like, this is great. And her face is like ecstatic, like while she's
Yeah,
talking about it, and her eyes are huge, like,
yeah.
ah.
I love her so much, and she's just the perfect counterpart to Lucy, who's like, "Okay." So this scene is a pivotal moment for them. I mean, they just were introduced, but when Sir John is like, "Yeah, Eleanor does have someone, and he was just here, but I can't tell you any more than that his name starts with an F," and then Mrs. Jennings goes, "Ferrers." Like, everyone hears her, and then Anne is like, "Oh, we know a Mr. Ferrers. We see him quite often. We know him very well." And then Lucy is immediately like, "Anne, what are you talking about? We don't know him that well." And and then Anne is like, "Oh, I always say the wrong thing." Ha 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 ha, which was one of my favorite lines.
Great foreshadowing.
Yes. Then Lucy is like, "Yes, you do always say the wrong thing." And she turns to Eleanor, and this is like an immediate she hears that Eleanor and Edward are like a thing, which she already had inklings of, I'm sure. But she hears that and she goes, "Eleanor, would you go for a walk with me?" And they like go outside. And she immediately jumps into the question, "Do you know Mrs. Ferrers?" Now, Question for Becca, who has read the book more times than any of us, I think. Did this conversation happen a lot later in the book?
No, this is when it happened.
It happens right away?
Like, they meet them, but it's, like, within, like, the first few, like, meetings. It's very early on.
Okay, it seemed fast to me to be like, "Oh, by the way, I'm gonna marry him."
Well, I mean, now that we know she's, like, conniving and, like, staking her claim, like, it's funny, now that I have that information, it makes how she, like, immediately takes Eleanor for a walk and is like, "Oh, so, like, oh, you know this family, like, oh, you know Edward, interesting," like, it kinda makes a little bit more sense why it happened that way, but again, like, to me, because I didn't get that villain vibe from her or even that, like, inkling that there was something more going on, it was more just, like to me, it seemed like a girl who just was, like, so excited to have, like, another girl her age who she could, like, tell this secret to.
That is really interesting to hear how that feels coming from someone who doesn't know because, yeah, knowing who Lucy Steele is, I was like, "Here she goes. She's on her Lucy Steele bullshit."
Yeah, she's very, it's a very tactical move on her part to neutralize a real threat.
I mean, it felt that way to me even in this adaptation. I think it just didn't feel as backed up afterwards, like, you were like,
Totally.
if you think back on it, you're like, "Well, why did she swoop in so fast?" But I guess she knew, she was kind of confirmed, her suspicions were confirmed, and so she felt threatened, and so she was like, "Well, I'm going to swoop in and see what happens."
Yeah. So this is where she tells her that she and Edward are engaged, and Eleanor's eyes get huge, obviously, so
Mhm.
big and red rimmed. And she's like, "Edward Ferrars?" And she's like, "Yes, yes." And she asks if the engagement is long standing. Lucy tells her that it's been 5 years. And I noticed in this moment, and I can't fully place either her or Anne's accents because in the book, they're written very Cockney, but and I don't know the difference between all the different British accents, but
Oh, there's so many.
Lucy, there's so many, and Lucy to me is giving like huge Ivana Lynch vibes, like Luna Lovegood, a little Irish, and like the way that she talks, and she's like, "Oh yes, like it's floaty."
Mhm.
I think one thing that's really brilliant that they do very lightly in this is that Anne has a full accent
Hmm.
and Lucy slips into it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
because she's trying to hide her low class. Mm.
Very clever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that is very clever.
Andrew Davies with those subtle details.
we love him. At the end of the conversation, she tells Eleanor that she has Edward's picture and Edward has a lock of her hair set in a ring. And we zoom in on Eleanor's face and she's like, "Oh my God." And Lucy's like, "Did you notice it?" And Eleanor's like, "Yeah, I did." And then Lucy asks if she can keep the secret. And Eleanor says one of my favorite lines from the book, which is, "I never sought your confidence, Miss Steele, but your secret is safe with me," which is like, I fucking hate you. But yeah, I'm not going to break your word.
Yeah, that was kind of a frustrating moment for me when I'm just like, "Damn it, Eleanor, like you're so honorable and you this is who you are and I know you can't be any other way, but I wish you could be more like Marianne in this moment and be like, how, like it's just allow your emotions to be, but that's not who Eleanor is. It just isn't.
The only reason Lucy can torture her is she's pegged her as someone who won't say anything and will be bound by this promise.
Yup.
Which is why she's such a good match for Edward, Eleanor, I mean, because they are both really bound by their promises and their
Mhm.
duty and their honor and their word.
But will they actually live happily ever after, or will they just not have a conversation with each other? Sometimes I wonder, like they'll just be like, "Oh yes, the pigeon tonight sounds delicious," and they both hate pigeon. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I just don't know.
I have faith that by the end of this story, Eleanor has learned to process her feelings a little better.
Yes, no, I agree. I agree.
Yeah. I liked that in this adaptation, they really got to have a conversation about their feelings before he proposed to her. Like, they got to actually talk about it, which we'll get
Mhm.
to when we get to that. But later that night, Marianne is like, "What was that long conversation with Lucy Steele about?" And Eleanor says, "Oh, nothing of consequence. She was telling me her hopes and dreams for the future." And Eleanor was like, "Oh, yes, very uninteresting."
Yeah.
Savage. Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Sassy Eleanor is actually something that came out a lot in the book that I feel like neither adaptation really well, actually, I think the 1995 didn't really delve into at all, but this one gave a little bit more of that with like her constant raised eyebrows and just like being like a little bit
Her
sassy.
wide-eyedness.
Yeah. She's like, "Did you really just say that to me?" Yeah. Later, though, she finds a little cave on the seaside to brood in. And this is like the start of her having feelings, but she really needs to learn to have them in front of people.
Ugh, poor Eleanor. I get it, Eleanor. I am also someone who is a big bottler of feelings. I wonder if it's an older child thing because I had a
Mm.
younger sister and I was told that, like, can't get mad at her, can't express your anger towards her, like, blah, blah, blah. And so I just learned to repress all the feelings until they could not be repressed anymore. And then I would explode. And I have taken a lot of work to get better at that.
It is absolutely an oldest child thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Also the oldest child over here. So
Yeah. No, there's a we'll get to it eventually, but the scene between Marianne and Eleanor, like, I felt that deep in my bones. Like, I was like, "Yes, I've been here. I get it."
Ugh. Eleanor and Marianne are amongst the most authentically written sisters in literature. It's fine. It's fine. Anybody who has a sister watches those scenes and it's just like, oh, it's me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then they're playing cards at the Middleton residence, and Mrs. Jennings invites the girls, namely Eleanor and Marianne, to London. And Lucy like looks up and she's like, "What? Like they're coming to London?" And Eleanor's like, "Mom, I don't know about all this." And Mrs. Dashwood is like, "No, you must go to London. It'll be good for you." And I insist. And Marianne is so happy and Eleanor is so stressed, and Lucy is like looking at them like, At this point, Lucy is already planning to go to London, right? She doesn't plan to go because they're going.
Oh, no, no. Lucy was coming. It's like last minute, Mrs. Jennings is like, oh, we should bring the Dashwood girls. And Lucy's like, no.
Yeah. So then the next scene that we get is them in the carriage to London and Mrs. Jennings snoring and Marianne being really excited to see Willoughby and Eleanor not letting herself get excited to see Edward. And then they arrive in London, and I think that that would be a good point to call this episode a full episode.
Kelsey and Zoe, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to tell the people where they can find you?
yes, thank you first of all for having us. If you guys want to check out our podcast, we are Tea and Strumpets, and you can find us wherever you get this podcast, as well as our website is romancepod.com, and we're on the social medias at T as in Tom, N as in Nancy, Strumpets.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. This has been an absolute delight. And listeners, you'll hear them both again on our next episode, covering the next part of the same episode of the 2008 Sense and Sensibility. So until next time, stay proper.
And find a man like Dan Stevens to chop wood for you angstily in the rain.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Just chop some wood. Chop some wood. Pod and Prejudice is edited by Molly Burdick and audio produced by Graham Cook. Our show art is designed by Torrance Brown. Our show is transcribed by SpeechDocs Podcast Transcription. For transcripts and to learn more about our team, check out our website at podandprejudice.com. To keep up with the show, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Pod and Prejudice. If you love what you hear, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/podandprejudice to see how you can support us, or just drop us a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Pod and Prejudice is sponsored this week by British art jewelers Tatty Divine. Head on over to www.tattydivine.com today. That's TATTYDEVINE.com. And be sure to use code Darcy at checkout for free international shipping on all orders. Valid through July 31st. Thanks for listening.